Right, and now starting officially, and for the third time, my name is Sasha, in charge of events, partnerships, community at Levagon Talkie Coding Bootcamp. Very happy to welcome you all to tonight's event workshop delivered by Joshua, who is working as a technical writer at Mercari. And without you, I'm giving a microphone to Josh. Josh, the stage is yours. Feel free to go ahead.
Great, thank you very much, Sasha. Yeah, glad to be here talking with everybody about how we can, kind of write some really great documentation, especially now. It's very top of mind since we've all kind of started working from home and had a little bit of a change in our working kind of atmosphere. So, really quickly, my name is Joshua Wong, and I believe a lot of you attending today are, probably in software engineering industry. But I'd like to kind of note also that technical writers are found in a variety of different industries. Obviously, not only in IT, but medical, science, manufacturing. It's technical writers and technical writing in general is really found in a lot of different places. So just a quick self-introduction into my background. So I've got 7 years, a little bit more than 7 years of experience like reviewing and managing documentation for things like internal IT help desks. And the target audience for those has been like internal employees, including like engineers, things like that. And some of that includes writing and narrating video tutorials, because documentation is not only about words, it's about sharing kind of the knowledge in the best format. And then, I've also spent 7 years in producing technical marketing materials. So the target audience for those kind of materials, mostly, things like B2B, business to business, and then also the B2C side to the consumer. And kind of in all of the different roles that I've had, whether it was for internal or external use, the focus is really always on or has always been on like providing a really like seamless user experience. I'm sure you've heard that in different kind of domains of expertise as well, whether it's like UX or, just, engineering in general. The goal is to provide a really great tool for that people want to use easily. And documentation is the same, whether it's internal or whether it's external too. I really believe that basically giving potential customers like I mentioned, even if it's internal employees, giving them a really great experience with documentation or really just any kind of content. By doing that, we can earn everyone's trust, and especially for potential consumers, we can earn their business. And even better is if we can turn them into advocates of a product that we have, or even just our brand. If you think of like Apple or Microsoft, or even Google, some of the top brands that have great products and products that are, fundamentally very easy to use because of the product documentation that they have. So this is our agenda for today. So we've got basically the role of the technical writer, types of documentation, some things to consider when creating technical content, and some examples of good and I would say subpar documentation. I do hesitate to say bad documentation. There are examples of bad documentation, but I feel like that is pretty rare. I feel like if you are making documentation, you're at least putting forth an effort to share that kind of knowledge with people. So I would say, subpar. Everything can be improved. So after that, I'll provide some resources that I find kind of helpful now and in the past and even up until now. And with that in mind, if you have any questions, as Sasha mentioned, as we go along, please feel free to ask them in the chat. And we'll go over some of those during the breaks and in the QA session. So first, let's quickly just discuss what a technical writer does. This really depends, because some organizations have technical writers and others don't. Usually it's the larger organizations that do have technical writers, because of obviously larger organizations kind of have a lot of people working on different teams. They realize at some point that having all of this knowledge, or just realizing that documentation does take a large amount of time, especially if it's just assigned to somebody who's not a dedicated technical writer, for example. So like, because of that large amount of like the resources that are required to not only produce good documentation, we also need to be able to make sure that we can maintain it and then organize it and then ensure that it's being used properly, both inside and outside of the organization, depending on the type of documentation. So we really want to make sure that the target audience for our documentation is really helping people, and that it's kind of kept top of mind going forward. Because if people find documentation and it's not what they were expecting, we kind of start losing people. So that's kind of where the technical writer comes into play, is that they really think about all of this before actually publishing the document. So yeah, very quickly. So what is a technical writer? Basically, on a very fundamental level, they help create and organize documentation, research and address pain points in content through direct feedback, or really by actively listening about the product or even about the documentation. They also determine how important content can be shared or otherwise promoted, because we want people to read it. We can't just assume that they're going to read it just because we publish it online. And then, yeah, also ensures that the documentation that's being created is well maintained and otherwise up to date. So those are kind of the 5 points that I really think about. But keep in mind that this is not a comprehensive list. So really within especially the tech industry, there are a lot of different types of technical writers, a little bit what I mentioned earlier. So for example, we've got people responsible for internal documentation and those responsible for external documentation. Sometimes those are two separate roles because it is very resource intensive. There's a lot of things to think about, but they still need to be able to kind of work together to have consistency between the two. And even within those, the responsibilities vary based on company and team culture, for example. And obviously this is not restricted only to technical writers. You know, this is really for everybody throughout the company, for example. So yeah, these 5 here are just some of the points that I like to kind of highlight. And these same points also can help really build like a strong documentation culture amongst not only technical writers. Like I mentioned, if there's no technical writer on staff, it doesn't mean that you cannot have a strong documentation culture. But it really takes an extra effort to kind of get to where you want to be, especially if you plan on, if your company plans on growing, for example. It just gets a little bit more difficult as time goes on and you start getting lots of documentation, internal and external. If you don't have like somebody really keeping an eye on that, whether it's a technical writer or you have the processes built in to your kind of development processes. So yeah, throughout the teams and divisions and company as a whole, a strong documentation culture is very, very, I would say, underrated and very helpful as your company grows or your team grows. So one of the questions I get a lot is, well, technical writers write, don't they? That really depends on the organization. In my experience, it's been a little bit different. So like a technical writer, what they do really depends on the organization. So some technical writers belong to a specific team. And in this case, the technical writer is also considered kind of like a subject matter expert. And those technical writers are able to write the documentation in addition to kind of managing content for that team's knowledge base internally or externally. Kind of depends on how the organization is. And that kind of method or that role of a technical writer who actually writes, that was pretty common probably about 30 years ago. But up until more recently, kind of number 2 here, so some technical writers work with multiple teams. That's been a little bit more common lately, and that's just because there's so many teams within companies now that having a dedicated technical writer for each team, usually the teams are fairly small. I hesitate to say it wouldn't create enough work for them because there's always work for technical writers. but it actually allows them to have a little bit more consistency across teams that are kind of like-minded. So if you have teams that kind of work similarly on the same product, it makes it easier for one technical writer, one dedicated person really, to work across all of those documents instead of having one technical writer per team or having one engineer work on like an individual piece of documentation and then another engineer work on an individual piece of documentation without having somebody to kind of really look at all of that holistically. So yeah, so in the case like of the technical writer in this case, working with multiple teams, they ensure that the documentation written by subject matter experts kind of follows editorial standards, consistency, and things like that. And like I mentioned, this allows the technical writer to kind of work with multiple teams to improve documentation, manage contents of a knowledge base a little bit more effectively, and even be more involved with strategizing like how to improve the experience for customers externally or employees or people even on the team kind of internally. There's really a lot to think about that, when we're in documentation, we're so in the moment, we just want to get this document published and then just call it quits. But there's a lot more that we have to think about, especially with, you put things online and we can't just have it sit there. And next, as I mentioned, some organizations just don't have technical writers. Instead, in those cases, like I mentioned, the organization relies more on engineers and product managers, project managers to kind of handle documentation related tasks. And this can work for smaller companies, especially. But as a company gets bigger, it is difficult to scale in that case, because kind of without a really keen eye for detail and really, I'm probably going to mention this a few times, but really advocating for the customer, looking at it from like an angle that, somebody who has no experience how to use your product, like a technical writer has that kind of aspect of really being diligent about advocating for the customer. And then also managing existing documentation and providing effective documentation becomes a little bit less important than releasing new products or features. So that's kind of why, kind of having a dedicated person work on documentation, or at least being very diligent about how your documentation is done, is really important. So yeah, I would say that not having a dedicated resource could end up being a slippery slope if you want to really have that really strong documentation culture in place within your team and also even within your company as well. Okay, so yeah, next, I'll give kind of some just quick examples of some types of kind of common documentation. So yeah, listed here, just some kind of common types of documentation that are, popular from both internal and external angles. This is not a comprehensive list. That's because there's all types of documentation sitting out there. So yeah, as you can see, there's a little bit of an overlap on some of these. However, the content between these two is, so obviously some of the content in the documentation is the same, but it's not always the same because the audiences are different. So for example, an organization might have a set of both internal and external API docs. And because of this, kind of how you write and how you deliver that content would be different as well. So some of the information in an internal API doc may not apply to external users. If you think like some really private, some kind of like IP related information within an internal API doc, you don't want that to get out to customers or somebody who might have bad intentions. So really making sure that the audience that you're writing for is in fact the audience you're actually writing for is very important, and not to consider just copy and pasting because the basis of the contents look the same. Really reviewing the documentation for that is also very important, and definitely takes a bit of quite a bit of skill to recognizing what needs to be changed, or maybe deciding like which template to use in those cases. So yeah, Yeah, so some of that information, like I mentioned, should be available only internally or maybe a specific group of people. But kind of regardless of the type of documentation, um, somebody, a dedicated person or an engineer or a technical writer, should confirm and ensure that accurate documentation is provided to the intended audience. Like I mentioned, it's very important to make sure that the audience, the reader, has the documentation that they need in order to use your product or do their job, or even just refer to. A lot of times for me for example, I'm not a professional engineer, but I do like to look at documentation that's a little bit, it's quite technical, but I end up referring to multiple different documents to kind of see, okay, does this one work? Does this one kind of explain how I want to achieve this, this outcome? And I'll look at a couple different ones and realize, okay, this third one is the best one, but these other two can kind of help me a little bit. In those cases, it would be nice to have like one solid document, like a single source of truth in that case. But sometimes it just doesn't work that way. When you're writing, though, you should really be thinking about that in mind, as kind of having like a really great comprehensive piece of documentation, or even a set of documentation if your product is that comprehensive. I don't want to say difficult, comprehensive. All right, so yeah, what to consider when writing? Let's take a quick, maybe 2-minute break here. There's quite a bit in here that I want to cover, so let's take a quick break here. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat.
Cool. Thank you so much, Josh. Yeah, so the first break comes in. If you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat. And I will probably start from the question that I had when you were explaining about the role of the technical writer, and that the technical writer does not necessarily have to write or something like that. Do you believe that it's more important for technical writer to be a tech person than a person that can write? Like what kind of the side is prevailing, the humanitarian side or the tech side?
That's one that personally I don't struggle with, but I hear concerns about that fairly often. I think somebody who is very curious would do well as a technical writer, for example. If you come in and you don't know a technology, but you actually have an interest in it, I think that that speaks a lot more than maybe if you use a product but you don't really have much of an interest on understanding how it works, for example. When I think of like hiring people, I always think like I always want to know, like, are they interested in technology in general? Maybe not exactly like that specific product or that specific language. I really want to know like how curious they are. I think the people that I've hired in the past have done well because they've been curious, but also very passionate about making sure that audiences and readers can really understand the content, and making sure that that content is maintained well, and really thinking of being the advocate for the customer, and thinking, okay, in 6 months, is this content still going to be relevant? If not, maybe I should set a reminder, or maybe we need to build it into how this product is developed, for example. Honestly, kind of one case, it was actually not very tech related. It was actually more about COVID related. We really had to get, make sure that people understood the importance of having up-to-date COVID-19 related kind of documentation. So yeah, there were some people who were very on the ball about that, and it was a lot easier for them to help update that documentation, not just rely on me.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I've got one question direct as well. I think it's related to the next one. First is, how did you get started with technical writing? And very much related to it is, where can one start to write technical? Maybe a blog? How do you market yourself? What is your advice for someone to build their portfolio?
Yeah. So luckily, you know, so when I first started my career, it was back in about 2007. We didn't have all these great opportunities that we do now. Nobody really was thinking about GitHub too much back then. I don't remember if it was even a company back in 2007, but yeah. Really, yeah, writing a blog is great. You can really start out very just small. And what I did was I just started fixing problems that I had at home. For example, like if my Wi-Fi router, suddenly stopped working and I actually had to, like update the firmware or something, I would, start writing instructions on how to do that, write down some troubleshooting steps, and just kind of have like a one-page document, and just kind of use that as kind of as a reference. But nowadays, I'm actually going to mention this a little bit more later as well. If you want to get really good practical experience with writing, there's really good opportunities with companies that have open source software. And that's because their documentation is usually also open source. And you can go in and you can suggest some updates or even just small edits. If you find a spelling mistake, um, I've, I've always encountered very open, kind of openness regarding that. So let's see. I think Microsoft. I think some parts of Google also have their documentation open sourced, and I believe GitLab also does. For example, those are some places where you can kind of check their documentation. And let's say if you're going through it and you're trying to install maybe like Visual Studio, VS Code, for example, and you find something in there as you're going through and you realize, oh, I don't think that's correct. Because when I did it, I did blah, blah, blah. You can mention that in the documentation as kind of a suggestion, and say, oh, I don't understand this part, or maybe it would be better to include a picture on this part. It's kind of difficult to understand, and just give a reason why. That's kind of more on the, I guess, the technical writing, the review aspect, which is common these days. But if you actually want to write, like actually do the writing, I would recommend writing. Yeah, like tutorials are probably one of the easiest ways to kind of break into technical writing. Blogs are great as well. I would probably focus more on a blog for promoting your kind of heavy technical content, which is also a craft in itself, actually. So yeah, open source documentation, I would say nowadays is probably the best way to gain experience outside of work.
Thank you. Just a confirmation question from Bill. Technical documents are so-called development documents. Is that correct?
Technical are also called development documents. Technical documents are a little bit more is more of a kind of like an all-encompassing phrase. Really, a technical document could be, some people consider a technical blog post as a technical document. A development doc or like a design doc is kind of a specific type of technical document, like when you're kind of starting to create like an app, for example, you would have like a development or like a design doc. And usually those have like, depending on the company, of course, kind of a template to follow in that case. Technical documents is just kind of the broad term for FAQs, development docs, help center articles, things like that.
Thank you. And last question for this break. What do you do to understand the pain points of the customers?
So let's see. Well, one of them is a little bit what I mentioned just a minute ago. Is so I mentioned you can go into, for example, Microsoft's documentation and go in there and make changes yourself. If you're on the other side, you can see the pain points by the person actually going in there and saying, "Hey, I don't understand this. Maybe we should change it." That's a good way to understand that pain point. Another way is really to have a kind of like a feedback button, for example. Does this content help you? I'm sure you've seen it on on a lot of sites. Does it a thumbs up or a thumbs down? If you give a thumbs down, a lot of times it'll ask for a little bit more. Why did you give it a thumbs down, for example? And that's a really good time for the people who are managing that documentation to take that feedback into consideration. There's very rarely been a time where I've discarded feedback at all. I consider almost all feedback very relevant. And that's just coming from the angle as, not everybody's a native English speaker, for example. Just because I think it's written well doesn't mean that somebody reading it, who may not have native level English, for example, or even if it's just the content is really difficult to read, having taken their concerns into consideration is important. So I would say kind of a good feedback method is really important for that, both externally and internally, I would say.
Cool, thank you. Let's then move on.
Cool. All right, so move on to what to consider when writing now. There we go. All right, so we've got these 5 here. And again, this is not all encompassing. These are kind of what I kind of broadly really try to focus on. So we've got 5 here: audience, context, accuracy, findability, and and these are really important in organizations where content about tech and products are just constantly being created or updated, for example. So the first one here, audience. So the first thing you should ask yourself when creating documentation is, who's my audience? And really the answer to this should be more than just, end users or my team. Obviously, you should think about that, but we should dig a little bit deeper when we think about the audience. So what I mean here is the content for business customers or is it for end users? Because depending on which one it is, you might need to change how you use your language. For example, not only, in addition to the technology, business customers tend to want to hear more about the benefits to the business, like how it can help them and all of their employees achieve an outcome, or the company as a whole, like return on investment and cost effectiveness, for example. With end users, it's a little bit different because usually end users don't want to hear about like an ROI, for example. Maybe they want to hear about how something can help them save a little bit of money, but it's not like business wide, for example. And then also another thing to address is the content internal and for your team. So we can, with that in mind, we kind of need to consider others as well. So like new hires or people transferring from other teams. And even when we report to senior management, for example, those other types of people who are currently not on the team usually need to know a little bit more information about the content that you're writing about. For example, like if you give new hires a document that works very well for your current team, you might find that it leaves the new hire or the person who's transferring a little bit confused on how the document is relevant to them. So I would say mentioning that within the document, and making sure that you're addressing kind of who the document is for. And that actually brings me to the next topic of context. So writing documentation without context can leave the reader confused, whether it's internal or external. We tend to think, especially for internal documentation, that we're in this bubble of everybody understands what I'm writing about. But like I mentioned earlier, if we have new people, transferees, things like that, or honestly, even if your company gets acquired by another company, they might look at the documentation and think, oh, I had no idea, like I have no idea what this means. So that's another very important aspect. And this is, let's see, leaving the reader confused is because of the context is also a bit kind of compounded when documentation is shared and then people start asking why the content is relevant or what it means to them. So if we create documentation and then we think, okay, this is great, I don't need to, include too much context because, at least people within my team or people who work on this product, for example, understand the context. But once it starts getting shared, and maybe senior management, for example, reads it and they realize, oh, I don't understand this. That's kind of the detriment there. Like once it gets shared and people start asking in like a Slack chat, for example, like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And then you have a lot of people asking questions when it could have been covered within the documentation. So kind of one way of providing context in a document is to include it in the overview or like a background section, basically to explain like the significance of that piece of documentation. And that'll really help you kind of lay out the groundwork at the very beginning so that not only that the reader understands, kind of what this documentation is about, but it also actually helps you in the future if you need to go back and look at it. I think the one tricky part is to remember that context doesn't mean writing the same sentences across all of your documents. Instead, we should really think about like reusing documentation that we've already created and refer the reader to it. For example, providing links to relevant and like existing documentation where necessary, because we would hate to have, 10 pieces of documentation, all with, the same kind of background section within a document, because every time it needs to get updated, we would have to revisit all of those 10 documents again. So if you can kind of reuse the document or kind of reuse kind of a document for context, it kind of helps us with like the single source of truth, which basically just means having one central place where the content is, and we just refer to it from there. It's a lot more manageable that way. Next, we have accuracy. So I think another thing to keep in mind also is just because we're writing something doesn't mean that it automatically is accurate or it's up to date. And because of this, I really encourage everyone, myself included, everybody really, to do things like peer reviews and have like a final like approver stage where the content that you're writing about is basically confirmed or verified as being correct by a colleague on your team, or if possible, even like a team lead. And doing this will really ensure that your documentation was basically declared as accurate by at least one other person. And that's just in case changes are made in the future that kind of cause the document to become outdated as soon as it's published. That's kind of the last thing we want to happen. Also, one example is if you've written like a tutorial, if you go through the tutorial and you follow the instructions you wrote, and then you can really see like if you have any gaps that you need to fill in, or if there's any missing content. You might also realize that, okay, maybe an image is better here, for example. I think that's mostly because users, definitely in my case, very often, users a lot of times give up on tutorials because of a lack of clarity or missing parts and just overall confusion. And the same can also be said for API references and other docs too, just kind of making sure that the content in it is still correct and up to date, really. And next we have findability. So really, we're in an age where everyone, we all search for content. And because of that, documentation needs to be discoverable as well. And that takes quite a bit of fine tuning, even on an internal angle, not thinking about external search engines like Google. Basically, two things here is that we need to make sure like we're using keywords consistently within the documentation. And that's just so that Google and other search engines, even internally, can pick it up and can provide the results that people are looking for. Basically, yeah, we also need to keep in mind that searching on internal knowledge bases can be just as tricky because it's not the same as an external search engine. For example, like when creating a design doc for internal use, in my opinion, I think it's best to have a little bit more of a descriptive title in that case. And that's because if your organization has a lot of teams and everyone titles all of their design docs as just simply design docs, you can kind of see that that's going to be a little cumbersome when you start searching in your system. You're going to find, just a huge list of, maybe 10 documents that are titled design docs. But how do you know which one is the design doc you're looking for? That's kind of what we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about, the findability of a document, making it a little bit more descriptive, just so that we internally can find it, or even if you're making an external document, people can find it, whether they go straight to your site or if they're searching on Google, for example. And also, to make sure that your documentation or pages are structured in your knowledge base so that users can navigate to your documentation in kind of a logical pattern. If a customer or a reader goes to like your site and they want to check out just a specific piece of documentation, they might get there and realize, oh, I also want to learn about this. And if they go to kind of maybe, for example, like your side navigation, that's going to be a very important time, because if they can't find what they're looking for within there, they may just leave and completely forget about your product. So that's also a very important aspect of documentation. So obviously we have the writing side, but we also have the organization side as well, which is also very important. All right, and last we have management. So this one is arguably one of the more difficult aspects, because it, like a little bit how I mentioned about the technical writer, it takes a dedicated person to really manage and organize the documentation. Basically, managing docs requires someone to make sure the content is up to date and relevant, remains discoverable, remains findable, is promoted when necessary. Maybe it's through blog posts or it's through social media, things like that. And also archive the content when it's just no longer relevant. That's also one that applies internally as well. You don't want a whole bunch of documents that are no longer relevant at all floating out there as being still referenceable. And also, with that in mind, because I did mention it is difficult, this is one of the most difficult aspects of documentation. A little bit on one of the answers or the questions that I answered earlier. If you make it easy for people to contribute to your docs, that's also very beneficial from whether it's internal or external documentation. Because if you provide guidelines, especially if you provide guidelines for contributing to your documentation, people are more likely to make changes or at least notify you if content needs to be updated, and even in some cases, update it themselves, which if you have time, I also recommend doing that. If you want experience, understand the product better, or if you just want to help your favorite company with their documentation. So if you're able to contribute to documentation, that also helps a lot with managing that and really make sure that people keep it top of mind. All right, so a little bit on how to make it easier to write. Really, in my experience, all the companies that I've worked with kind of have their own specific ways of writing and publishing content. There's really no one size fits all approach to documentation because we all do it a little bit differently. We all have different documents that we cover, but we can remove a lot of guesswork by doing things like having documentation related tasks added to kind of our existing processes, like our existing development processes, for example, kind of built into there so that we don't skip over it or we don't kind of say we'll do it later. And then let's see, using templates just to save time. Maintaining a style guide for consistency. This is helpful, I think, for everybody. But again, this one's a little bit more technical writer specific because they would use the same style guide across all of the documentation, but it really makes for a good voice. And then really practicing writing and getting feedback is also very important. Like I mentioned, if you can update some open source documentation, that's a really great way to do it. Adding documentation related tasks to your existing development processes. By adding it to your existing processes, you can consider how to approach documentation and create or update it like as you work. And by doing this, you will reduce the surprises and instances of, I forgot what I did here in the future. Even in my case, there's been times where I go back to documentation even 3 days later, and I'm writing a tutorial, and I think, I don't know what I was talking about here because I kind of skipped over it while I was actually working on creating something. Build it into your process is definitely one of the best ways to do it. And also keep in mind that this doesn't just mean like create documentation. Kind of what I mean here is keep documentation top of mind. For example, if you're updating a feature or rebuilding a login process in an app, consider the documentation that you previously created and determine if it's reusable or if it needs to be made obsolete or read-only or archived or updated. Really just keep it top of mind. Doesn't mean that you need to create a whole new set of documentation. Just need to keep it at the top of mind. And then use templates. This one's kind of self-explanatory. They really serve multiple purposes. They can help with things like maintaining consistency in the layout and formatting across document types. And I think a really important one too, if the templates are created properly, is guiding writers on what needs to be documented or addressed. One of the most difficult things about documentation that I often hear about, and it's with me as well, is that starting with a blank Google Doc is intimidating. It can be intimidating. You have the thoughts in your mind. You know how you think you can explain it, but once you get to a blank page, it just comes in your mind like, well, where do I start? And so having a template really can help with things like that. And you can get templates off of Confluence, for example, has built-in templates. There's some resource at the end called the Good Docs Project that I'll share with you. And they have just different kinds of templates that you can use to kind of get started with some of your documentation. And then kind of a lot of the templates are used in like a concept, task, and reference kind of categories as well. So it's very broken out very easily. Next is so the style guide. So a style guide does take quite a bit of effort, especially if you have some things like branding that you need to think of in-house or when showing things externally. But over time, having the style guide can really help make your documentation consistent and easy for people internally and externally to understand. So a style guide can help really also explain complex topics while maintaining consistency across documentation and describe how you should format that documentation, for example, as well. And just a quick note here, one of my favorite, actually really my go-to style guide is the Microsoft style guide, just because of how comprehensive it is, especially for external documentation. I believe that style guide has been around for about 30 years now, almost. Yeah, it's been very helpful in my 15-year career. So I really recommend that one. Yeah, and then just practice writing, getting feedback, as I mentioned. Yeah, it's a skill that takes practice, and getting feedback is one of the best things that you can get, whether it's from classmates, colleagues, friends, family, strangers, even. If you can get somebody to kind of give you some feedback on your writing, I think that's just the best thing, and not taking anything too personal, because writing can always be improved, and so can content. Especially if somebody finds it needs to be updated. Yeah, just things like making sure that you have clear sentences, shorter sentences, and understanding where, like an image or a screenshot can help with explanations. That definitely takes a little bit of time to understand, but it's definitely not impossible. It's just something that takes quite a bit of practice. All right, so yeah, good and bad examples of documentation. Let's take just a quick maybe 1-minute break here. Maybe we can answer some questions it looks like we have.
Yeah, let's probably take this one question. Any advices on how to engage people at updating documentation internally?
Internally, engaging people to update documentation. Yeah, that's a tough one, because it really, that's where the strong like documentation culture comes into play. If you use something like Slack or Microsoft Teams, that could be one of the ways to get to kind of encourage people. So for example, if you have Slack, for example, at the very top of your channel, you can pin like the contribution guidelines, for example. It's really welcoming when you see things like the words contribution guidelines. Usually when I see that wording, I think, okay, they respect my opinion, if I were to actually give my opinion. But there are also some, for example, usually GitHub or GitLab repositories, they have contribution guidelines. If there's no contribution guidelines, I tend not to want to get too deep in their documentation. So I think internally engaging people to update the documentation is to have contribution guidelines. And then also, even if it's within your team or the people that you work with, just make it very clear that you are open to getting feedback, or maybe even within the document, you can mention, if you have feedback, please contact the Slack channel, for example. But yeah, that is a very tricky one, to actually get people to update your documentation without being very annoying. For example, like you don't want to keep saying in a Slack chat, hey, let us know if we can update our documentation, for example. That's kind of not the right way to go about it. So yeah, I would say contribution guidelines is one of the best ones internally.
Thank you. I think that's all questions for now. Let's probably move on.
Okay, cool. Yes. So let's see. Got some good and bad examples. So this is the first one here, and I made this one. I didn't want to single out any specific organization, so I just made this one on my own. It's a short video, so I'm just going to play it a little bit. And if anybody has any concerns about what they see, go ahead and just say what you think about this documentation. For example, what do you think is bad about this example that I'm showing here? Any concerns about that one? Let's see. Maybe could use subheadings, missing subsections, bullet points, picture. Need some markdown for code example. Everybody has really good answers. That's exactly what I wrote down in mine too. Lack of useful formatting to break up the text. Yep, exactly. This isn't technically a wall of text, but it to me, it feels like when it's not easy to read. Emphasis on points. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So let's see. I also want to kind of go up to the top of this one. Let's see if I can do that. So if you can see up at the top here also, we kind of skimmed over at the beginning, but where it says updated, you can see it says 2018. And then right below that, we also have owner, but it's blank. So we don't really know who to contact if we want to update this documentation, or who owns this document. We would have to go hunting for the person, whether we have to look on Slack, or if we know that, if we're familiar with the owner of the repository, but we would still have to ask who's responsible for this documentation also. But yeah, everybody's answers are exactly what I wanted to point out. Subheadings would be just wonderful here. Some bulleted lists, maybe even a numbered list, for steps. Images would be great here because it's trying to explain how to do something. I believe, there's a comment about formatting and markdown. There's so much we can do here, just visually, right? Without even looking at the content that we have here. Next, this is a little bit less about writing. This is one that a little bit more about management of the documentation we have. So you can see we have 3 software libraries here. And if we go to the Java one, we can see that this repository is now read-only, and we don't really know what it's about within the first glance. There may be an explanation below. Spoiler alert, the information in the README has not been updated either, so we don't know where to go once we get here. So let's go to the C library, and we have the same issue here as well. And you can see last updated, I believe, 3 years ago was the earliest one. So obviously, if we go to JavaScript library, that one's going to be updated, right? No. So we also have under the about, this library is no longer maintained. So that's a little bit disappointing because this is actually on a, these links are on the company's docs site. So where would I go if I want to find out, how to, build this company's products into my products? Well, in that case, I would have to go fishing inside of their GitHub repository and kind of make my own guesses without much guidance on that side. So really, not only the content of documentation, but also guiding users, showing them where to go, whether that's internal or external people, is just really important. So I would like to point out this one here. This is, I think, a really good example of documentation. This is Visual Studio Code, kind of the suggestions feature. You can see here, I really like the use. They just use a standard GIF for a very short way of explaining how the feature can be used. And in some cases like this, you may not even need to read the actual content, but the content is still important because we have to think about, well, for example, non-native English speakers may need to, copy and paste into a translator. And we also need to think about things like accessibility as well. There may be people who need to have the page read to them instead. This one's also a good example. This one's a little bit more about, it's a blog post, but it actually posts to a more technical kind of document. But this really introduces people before they kind of get heavier into kind of the more technical aspect. And as you can see here, yeah, this one has great formatting, subheadings, bullets, as everybody mentioned earlier. Yeah, I think this is a very good example, and also has some interesting words for findability as well. I believe in the next one here, they also use like a hashtag, for example, so to make sure people can find it, and it's unique, which is really great. All right, so yeah, we're running a little bit low on time. Really quickly, I'm going to show you this page here. It's resources that I really recommend. I suggest right now, if possible, if you can take a screenshot of this, and you can just search for it on your time. Yeah, I think these are very, very helpful. Kind of labeled these kind of how I thought they were. So like communities write the docs. There's like a Slack channel dedicated there. I think there's more than 15,000 people, technical writers, product managers, all kinds, engineers, all kinds of people just asking about documents, suggesting things like that. It's a really great resource. And then things like documenting APIs. There's a podcast. There's a talk. Let's see. There was that talk by Carl Dubost, another online talk by the Wagon, called "Managing the Rest of the Web," which kind of focuses more on like managing content online, which I think is really great. I recommend listening or watching that one as well if you have time. And then style guides and the templates that I mentioned earlier too is also a great start as well. Obviously, you might need to customize it a bit. So, all right, so we can move on to Q&A now. Sorry, went a little bit over. I wasn't expecting for me to talk this long, but any questions?
Thank you so much, Josh. So yeah, we have probably a couple of more minutes for Q&A session. If you have any questions related to the content of today's presentation, related to the technical writing, also related to resources as well, feel free to write down in the chat. And from my side, thank you so much for mentioning the Carl's workshop as well as a resource for people to watch. This is really nice.
Yeah, it's great. His actually kind of managing content, managing documentation. That's kind of what I've been focusing on more lately. It is very difficult, especially as I mentioned, with people working from home, for example. The goal is to save time for everybody, whether it's employees or whether it's customers in general. Just making a seamless documentation experience is really important these days.
And there was one question from my side when you shared about the updating, about the relevance. So in case of the technical documentation, when you update something, do you need to create a new version of the same content and write in something like it's updated, or you need to edit the same text and just write in and update it? For example, it's different for laws, right? For some legal documents, you need to have several versions, but what about the technical documentation?
Well, if it's external, that is a tough one, because when you think about like a product that has a version 1 and a version 2, let's just say Microsoft Office. You have Microsoft Office 2016 and you have Microsoft Office 2020, 2019. I forget which year it is now. I just use the online version now. But you still need the content for both versions, right? You can't just get rid of one. In those cases, I believe there is kind of a method to make that content usable across both sides. But it's still, in my experience, having to kind of manage both of those separately has been the case. Now, if you're updating kind of a document that doesn't apply to doesn't have that kind of versioning, for example, there's been cases where like I've actually just within Google Docs kind of renamed, sorry, not renamed, put a name onto the version history to say, hey, this is version 1 is here, and basically everything before it would be version 1, for example. But ideally, it would be nice to have like the single source of truth where it's just one document type, so we're not having to update a bunch of different documents, and we're not having people refer to kind of outdated documents as well. So it can be tricky. It really depends on kind of the type of documentation, the situation that, and the situation that the product or the service is in, for example.
Thank you. Very interesting question. Which third-party tools do you use to manage your documents?
Oh, third-party tool for managing my documents. You know, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but for the longest time, I actually used PowerPoint to make kind of video content. More recently, I use this tool called, I'm on Windows, so sorry for everybody else who uses a Mac. I use, it's called Screen Bits, and it's just a very simple videos kind of screenshot tool. I've also used one called, I think it's Camtasia, made by TechSmith, and that's available on Mac and Windows as well for both. And that was a pretty good tool because you could also do like narrations and things like that.
Thank you. So I think that answers the question from Milan. Would you recommend a software technique for making videos to add in the documentation, showing a feature of the software to users, for example?
Recommend a software technique for making videos to add in the document. Showing a feature of a software to users, for example. Yeah, I definitely would, especially if it's kind of a complex feature. I mean, if it's like the suggestions feature in GitHub, or sorry, in a Visual Studio Code that I showed earlier, I would recommend, yeah, showing that to users if it's a little bit difficult. And in those cases, you know, yeah, using, I mean, even if you just have PowerPoint, I think that's fine too. I think you can do screen recording on there.
Thank you. Would you, in case of development and the hosting of apps in GitHub, what do you find more intuitive? Add the documentation directly to your repo or have it in read the docs?
Oh, you know, I have not used read the docs that much. I personally like it within the repo, and that's just because it's close to the code. Makes it a little bit more, I think, manageable that way. Let me see though. Yeah, because maybe I don't know. I haven't looked that much into read the docs, but when I have it in my repo, I like it because it's close to the code. And in that case, I can still use another static site generator like mkdocs, for example, or Docusaurus, for example, and show that documentation in like a easy to read way, and not just in Markdown. So, but definitely, I prefer documentation close to the code. It's like the docs-like code method, and honestly, actually having the docs within the same repo as the code also helps everyone keep it top of mind that the documentation is also part of the code. It's more likely to get updated also.
Thank you. And probably to wrap up this event, do you personally have any blog, the technical blog that you're writing, or anything that we can probably find what you have been doing? If you want to make it public, if not, it's completely fine.
Oh, you know, let's see. Right, lately, I've kind of just been putting stuff on GitHub. A little bit embarrassing. I used to have a blog and I ran it on a Raspberry Pi here at home, and then my Raspberry Pi crashed, and I haven't revived it. And it had, I mean, it had a blog, but it was just kind of a little bit of rambling. But maybe one day I'll revive it. But I right now, yeah, GitHub is probably where I put
yeah,
most
so
of my
if you would like
documentation.
to share your GitHub, probably feel free to post a link in the chat, or this is something that I can probably post later as well through our Meetup platform, or whichever is faster and convenient.
Yeah, actually, I'll post it right now. There we go.
Cool.
Yeah, it's just github.com/Josh-Wong. And yeah, I have like a static site generator on there. If you go to the URL on there, you can kind of see all the documentation that I have kind of set up in there. It's not too much right now because I'm a lot of it I have just kind of locally. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's time for us to wrap up this talk. Thank you. It was really interesting, very engaging, a lot of useful information. I saw a lot of Levagon students as well in the chat, and hope it will be useful for them in their career as well. Thank you so much. It was really nice to have you, and thank you everyone for joining. Looking forward to seeing you at our upcoming workshops. And Josh, thank you so much again.
Yeah, no problem. And feel free to reach out to me. There's a lot to talk about with documentation, knowledge management. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or GitHub or really anywhere. So
thank you so much. And everyone have a great evening if you're in Japan. Have a great day if you're in another time zone, or have a great morning as well. Thank you so much. And yeah, see you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending, everybody.